On a summer morning in Key West, Florida, Michael and Emily Harris set out for what should have been the highlight of their honeymoon. A boat ride, a dive into clear blue waters, and memories to last a lifetime. Emily was excited. She loved the ocean. Minutes after diving, everything turned to chaos. Other swimmers saw the water around her turn red. A shark struck with sudden force. Guides pulled her back onto the boat, but it was too late. Emily was gone. The story spread quickly. A rare, tragic accident at sea. A young bride killed on her honeymoon. But the tragedy didn't end there. Within months, Michael collected over $1 million in life insurance. He moved on, bought a new house, and 2 years later married again. Friends thought he had rebuilt his life. Until one night at a party, after too many drinks, Michael opened his mouth and revealed a dark secret. He said he had set Emily up. He said he made sure the shark would find her. That confession reopened the case. Investigators dug into his past, the insurance files, and the details of that day at sea. What they found turned a shocking accident into one of the most disturbing insurance murder cases Florida had ever seen. If you want us to keep exposing cases like this, where love turns deadly and truth hides for years, make sure to subscribe. Hit the like button so more people can hear Emily's story. And share this video to keep her memory alive. Michael Harris was 32 years old, living in Austin, Texas. He worked as an IT systems engineer for a mid-sized company. His job was stable, his income comfortable, and his life, at least from the outside, looked steady. Friends described him as quiet and withdrawn. He rarely opened up, avoided large social gatherings, and seemed more interested in money and security than fun or adventure. Some people called him distant, others simply said he was hard to get close to. Emily Harris was 29. She taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school in Austin. Her students adored her. Parents said she had the kind of energy that made children feel safe and encouraged. Colleagues saw her as reliable, always willing to help, always with a smile. Unlike Michael, Emily was outgoing. She loved the ocean. She had been swimming since childhood, and every summer she traveled with her family to Galveston Beach. For her, being in the water wasn't just recreation. It was joy. It was tradition. Diving and snorkeling were her favorite things to do. Michael and Emily met on a dating app. It started with a few casual messages, then long conversations that stretched into the night. Within weeks, they were inseparable. After a year of dating, they married in a small ceremony attended by family and close friends. The marriage, at least online, looked perfect. Their Facebook pages were full of smiling photos, dinners at nice restaurants, day trips outside the city. Posts with captions like, "Forever Love" and "Soulmate." To outsiders, they looked like a couple living a dream. Behind the scenes, Emily sometimes confided in her friends. She admitted Michael could be controlling. He liked to know where she was, what she was doing, and who she was with. At times it felt like too much. But Emily brushed it aside, telling herself that Michael just wanted stability, that he was serious about their life together. She wanted children soon. She told coworkers that she wanted to be a young mother, that she didn't want to wait too long. She had plans for her career and family, and she thought Michael shared those dreams. But Michael was not enthusiastic about children, or about the ocean. Then came a decision that would later define everything. In the weeks before their trip, Michael insisted on purchasing life insurance. Not just a basic policy, but a large one worth over $1 million. He explained it as a precaution, something every responsible couple should do. Emily was hesitant, but in the end she trusted him. She signed the papers. Her friends thought it was strange. One recalled Emily mentioning that Michael had been unusually firm about it, telling her it was necessary before they traveled. She thought it was odd, but harmless. She believed her husband. In hindsight, that signature was the turning point. That policy would later become the motive prosecutors used to argue that Michael planned far more than a vacation. At the time, though, no one questioned it. Emily packed her snorkeling gear, including the GPORO she used to record family trips. She was excited for the ocean in Key West. She had never been there before, and she wanted to capture every moment. Michael, meanwhile, seemed calm, almost too calm. He didn't share Emily's enthusiasm about diving, but he didn't argue. He gave the impression of a man simply going along, letting his wife enjoy what she loved most. On social media, days before their flight, they posted a photo at the airport with the caption, "Adventure starts here." Emily looked radiant. Michael, as always, had a flat smile. Friends commented with hearts and wishes for a safe trip. The background of this couple shows two very different people. Emily, full of life, trusting, and devoted to her passions. Michael, reserved, focused on money, and controlling in ways Emily overlooked. Their marriage had lasted just over a year. It was still in the stage where friends thought they were settling into routines, building a future. But the insurance papers told a different story. They revealed preparation, timing, and a motive that would not be visible until tragedy struck. For investigators, this detail would later become the first red flag. Why did Michael insist on $1 million policy right before a vacation? Why was he so determined to finalize it when Emily had no serious health issues and no children yet? Michael and Emily Harris arrived in Key West, Florida, at the start of June. It was peak tourist season. The town was crowded with visitors, the beaches full, and the small marina busy with boats heading out for snorkeling and diving trips. For Emily, it was the highlight of their honeymoon. For Michael, it was another part of the plan. They booked a snorkeling tour through a local company, one of the most popular in the area. The package included a half-day trip by boat to coral reefs, about 30 minutes offshore. Each tour carried small groups, usually around a dozen people, with one captain and one guide in charge of safety. Their guide that day was Captain Daniel Reed, a man with over 20 years of experience taking tourists into the water. On the second morning of their trip, Emily woke up early, full of energy. She packed her GoPro, adjusted her fins, and kept talking about how excited she was to swim among the reefs she had only ever seen in magazines. She told other guests this was her dream. Michael was different. While Emily smiled and chatted, Michael remained calm, even detached. He spoke little, kept checking his gear, and looked focused. Other passengers would later say he seemed strangely at ease. Unlike most first-time snorkelers, he showed no nerves. At the dock, Captain Reed gathered the group of 12 tourists and gave the usual instructions. Stay close to the group, keep your head on a swivel, and signal if you see anything unusual. He added a warning. That week, there had been a few shark sightings in the area. It wasn't rare, but it meant they needed to stay together. The group nodded, but Emily wasn't worried. She was too excited. By 11 o'clock, the boat left the marina and headed into open water. The sun was strong, the sea calm. The ride lasted about half an hour, and soon the reefs came into view beneath the waves. The water was clear enough to see the colors of the coral from the surface. At 11:30, the tourists prepared to enter the water. One by one, they climbed down the ladder, adjusted their masks, and slipped beneath the waves. Emily went down with Michael at her side. She wore her GoPro on a chest mount, ready to film everything. 5 minutes later, the calm turned to panic. Several people heard a muffled scream through the water. A dark cloud spread around Emily. It was blood. Within seconds, swimmers nearby realized she had been hit. A shark had struck with terrifying speed, locking onto her leg. Tourists shouted, kicked, and splashed in shock. Captain Reed reacted immediately. He blew his whistle and called the group back toward the boat. Two men closest to Emily tried to push the shark away, while another helped lift her toward the ladder. Michael came up behind them. Witnesses later recalled that he showed no sign of injury. His wetsuit was intact, his movements steady. He followed the others back to the surface as Emily was hauled onto the deck. On board, the scene was chaos. Blood poured from Emily's leg. Guides and passengers tried to stop the bleeding with towels and straps, but the wound was catastrophic. Emily lost consciousness within minutes. Despite every effort, she was pronounced dead on the boat. Michael held her body and cried loudly. To those watching, it looked like the raw grief of a husband who had just lost his wife in the most horrifying way imaginable. No one suspected anything more. The other guests were shaken. Some were in tears, some silent in shock. They had come for a day of snorkeling and now stood frozen as the body of a young woman lay on the deck. Captain Reed called the Coast Guard and reported a fatal shark attack. The boat returned to shore quickly. Authorities met them at the dock. Statements were taken. Everyone described the same scene: a sudden attack, a fast and violent strike, blood in the water, and a husband crying over his wife. The case was logged as a tragic accident. In the following hours, reporters heard about it and rushed to cover the story. Headlines described it as a rare event, a freak tragedy that one tourist later recalled, "I had been on these trips before. Usually if a shark shows up, it circles, it watches. But this one came in straight. It went for her, like it already knew." That statement would only gain importance years later, when the case was reopened. For now, the investigation ended quickly. The Coast Guard filed the report as accidental death caused by a shark attack during recreational diving. No foul play, no suspects, no crime. Michael returned to Austin days later with his wife's remains. He organized a small funeral and stood beside her family, playing the part of the grieving widower. Behind the scenes, he had already filed the insurance claim. The vacation that was supposed to mark the start of a long life together ended in blood and silence. On the surface, it was a tragedy of nature. But beneath it, the details were already there. The calm husband, the suddenness of the attack, the timing of the insurance policy, clues hidden in plain sight. It would take 2 years, a second marriage, and one drunken confession before anyone would go back to those minutes in the water and ask the question that changed everything. Was this really an accident, or had it been a setup from the start? News of Emily Harris's death spread quickly. Within hours, Florida outlets ran the story. By the next morning, national papers picked it up. Headlines called it a freak tragedy. Young bride killed in rare shark attack. The Miami Herald carried photos of the rescue boat returning to shore. USA Today ran a short piece, calling it heartbreaking and unusual. Reporters emphasized the rarity. Fatal shark attacks in Florida were almost unheard of. Emily had become one of those rare cases. To the public, it was simple. A young woman on her honeymoon, in the wrong place at the wrong time. A shark had struck, she had died, and her husband had been left widowed. The story carried sympathy but no suspicion. The Coast Guard investigated in the immediate aftermath. Their role was routine: gather witness statements, document the location, and confirm the cause of death. Passengers on the boat told the same story: a sudden attack, a violent strike, a frantic effort to save her. Only a few months later, Michael filed his insurance claim. It was processed quickly. There was no dispute, no competing beneficiary. The documents were in order, the death was certified as an accident, and within weeks the money was released. The payout exceeded $1.2 million. It gave Michael a new beginning. He used the money to clear debts and soon bought a modern house in Austin. Friends noticed the shift. He seemed less burdened. He was careful not to appear celebratory, but the lifestyle change was obvious. A new car appeared in his driveway. His routines changed. This is when the doubts began inside Emily's family. Her younger sister, Megan Harris, was the first to voice them. She remembered a conversation with Emily before the trip. Emily had texted her that Michael had been insistent about life insurance. "It's strange," she wrote, "but he says it's just being responsible." Megan told police she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When investigators revisited Emily's phone, they saw the message. Emily had signed the policy only weeks before leaving for Florida. Megan insisted that detail mattered. She believed her sister never wanted or needed that kind of insurance, and only signed because Michael pushed her. Friends of Emily came forward with similar stories. In the weeks before the honeymoon, she had mentioned Michael's fixation with paperwork. He brought it up several times, according to one colleague. He seemed almost obsessed with making sure it was done. At the time, her friends thought it was odd, but not dangerous. After her death, the detail looked different. Journalists also began asking questions. Marine experts, interviewed for follow-up stories, made cautious observations. They said the attack seemed unusual. Sharks often circle or hesitate before striking. In this case, the witnesses described a direct, targeted hit. The animal went straight for Emily's leg. One biologist told a reporter, "That's rare behavior. It suggests something drew the shark in fast." But unusual did not mean criminal. There was no forensic evidence on the boat that suggested foul play. The wetsuit had been for Emily's family. The feeling was different. They buried their daughter, but the questions kept coming back. Why had Michael forced the policy so close to the trip? Why had the shark attacked so quickly and so decisively? Why did Michael seem so calm before the dive? Without proof, those questions were left hanging. The case file stayed closed, labeled a freak accident. But in private, Megan and others held on to their doubts. Looking back, this moment in the timeline was critical. The accident had been logged, the payout delivered, and the world had moved on. Yet, the seeds of suspicion had already been planted. They would grow over the next 2 years. They would resurface when Michael remarried, and they would erupt when, at a party, he opened his mouth after too many drinks and revealed words that no one could ignore. For now, though, the story of Emily Harris ended on paper as a tragic encounter with a shark. A line in an official report, a case closed. But beneath that, in the quiet conversations of family and friends, the first flames of doubt had already started to burn. 2 years after Emily Harris's death, Michael Harris had built a new life. He had remarried. His new wife was Sarah Miller, a 27-year-old administrative assistant at the same company where Michael worked in Austin. The wedding was quiet. It wasn't a grand event, just a small ceremony attended by a handful of Sarah's relatives and a few colleagues. There were no reminders of Emily, no photos, no mention of the past. Emily's family, who had buried their daughter less than 2 years earlier, received no invitation. The change in Michael's circumstances was obvious. With the life insurance money from Emily's death, more than $1.2 million, Michael had cleared his debts. He purchased a modern home in an Austin suburb. He bought a luxury car. He began to live the life he had always wanted but could never afford before. For Sarah, it looked like stability. For Michael, it was the payoff. He told people he had moved on. At work, he said the tragedy was behind him. To friends, he described himself as someone who had found a second chance. He rarely mentioned Emily, and when he did, it was in short pass. At these gatherings, Michael sometimes made comments that left people uncomfortable. He would laugh, hold a drink in his hand, and say, "Emily's accident paid off." At first, those who heard it thought he was joking. Maybe it was his strange way of dealing with the past. They laughed nervously, then moved on. But he said it more than once. Over time, the joke didn't sound like a joke anymore. The words came up again and again, especially when Michael had been drinking. His tone shifted. It was less of a laugh, more of a statement. He didn't sound like a grieving husband remembering a tragedy. He sounded like a man proud of how things had turned out. For Sarah, these moments became harder to ignore. She had believed she was with a man who had endured an accident that could have broken him. Instead, she was living with someone who treated that accident as a financial windfall. At parties, she heard him talk about the insurance money, not with shame, but with satisfaction. She began to wonder if he saw Emily's death not as a loss, but as a victory. Friends noticed, too. Some began whispering among themselves. They compared notes, repeated what they had heard, and realized they weren't the only ones who thought his words were strange. Still, no one took action. They had no proof of anything criminal. It was only talk. And even if it was tasteless, people thought it might just be the alcohol speaking. For Sarah, the unease grew heavier. She remembered the way Michael rarely spoke of Emily in private. She noticed how he never looked troubled when her name came up. She saw how quickly he spent the money, and she couldn't shake the way he laughed about the accident. She wondered if the man she married was hiding something darker than grief. Michael, meanwhile, showed no concern. He enjoyed his new home, his new marriage, and the attention he got from his social circle. To him, the past seemed buried. No investigation was open. No one had challenged him. On paper, he was a widower who had suffered tragedy, then found happiness again. In reality, his behavior raised red flags that only grew brighter with time. The pattern repeated itself. Parties, drinking, the same line. And then came the moment that changed everything. At one of his parties, drunk and careless, Michael said it again. This time, someone decided to act. A guest took out a phone, pressed record, and captured Michael's voice. His words were clear. "Emily's accident paid off. That's how I got rich." It was no longer a rumor. It was evidence. That recording would leave the circle of friends and reach the police. It would reopen a case that had been closed as a freak accident. It would unravel the image Michael had built and expose the truth he had tried to bury. But before that happened, in those 2 years of his new life, Michael Harris had shown the world who he really was. He was not a man broken by tragedy. He was a man celebrating it. And he was about to pay the price for what he thought was the perfect crime. The night that changed everything started like so many others. A house full of guests, music, drinks poured without measure. Michael Harris, 2 years removed from the so-called accident, had become known for his heavy drinking. That night he pushed even further. Friends later said he was slurring, unsteady, louder than usual. And then he said it. In the middle of a crowded room, Michael laughed and told the group, "I fed her to the sharks. That's how I got rich." The words landed like a punch. Some people chuckled nervously, thinking it was just another one of his tasteless lines. But this was different. He wasn't smirking, wasn't shrugging it off. He repeated it, not once, several times. Each time his voice shifted further away from humor and closer to truth. 2 of his longtime friends, men who had stood by him through the past years, exchanged a look across the room. They had heard the line before, but never like this. Not with that edge in his tone. One of them, Kevin Brooks, made a decision. He slipped his phone from his pocket, opened the recorder, and held it low by his side. What he captured over the next few minutes would rip open a case the state of Florida had already closed. The recording was damning. Michael's voice was... Investigators contacted Kevin Brooks, who turned over the full recording. They reviewed every second. They listened as Michael laughed, then shifted into a flat, confident tone. They heard him brag about the insurance money, about how smart he had been, about how Emily had no idea what he had planned. That was enough to move the case from speculation to investigation. Detectives began retracing old steps. They pulled the original case file, the Coast Guard reports, and the photographs. They called back witnesses from the dive boat. Captain Daniel Reed, who had led the tour that day, repeated what he had always remembered. Michael was strangely calm before entering the water, unlike other first-time divers. Now, that detail mattered. Reed also confirmed that the shark had attacked with unusual precision, heading straight for Emily. At the time it seemed bizarre, but explainable. With Michael's words on tape, it looked different. Next, investigators turned to Michael's new wife, Sarah Miller. She had lived with him through those years of parties and late-night drinking. When questioned, Sarah broke down. She admitted that she had heard Michael say similar things at home late at night when he was drunk. He had told her that Emily's death had set him up for life. He had laughed about the insurance money, sometimes boasting that he was smarter than anyone gave him credit for. Sarah's statement confirmed what the recording already suggested. These were not isolated comments. This was a pattern, a repeated confession disguised as drunken banter. Detectives also revisited the insurance files. They discovered that Michael had pushed to finalize Emily's policy just 2 weeks before their honeymoon. They found emails where he pressured the insurance company to approve an additional rider for accidental death coverage. It matched his own words about being prepared. The weight of evidence was building. At this stage, it was still circumstantial. A recording, a second wife's testimony, a tour guide's memory, insurance paperwork. None of it on its own could prove that Michael had baited Emily's wetsuit. But together, the pieces painted a picture too dark to dismiss. The investigation widened. Detectives interviewed friends who had been at Michael's parties over the past 2 years. Several admitted they had heard the same line. Emily's accident paid off, often enough to feel disturbed. Some described him laughing about how the money had changed his life. Others remembered him saying he had planned well. These statements, though not as sharp as the recording, strengthened the case. Sarah's cooperation was critical. She handed over messages where she had confided in a close friend, telling her she felt uneasy about Michael's obsession with the past. She explained that she initially thought his comments were just drunken slips, but after the recording surfaced, she realized he might have been telling the truth all along. Piece by piece, the wall Michael had built around himself began to crack. Within months, the state of Florida had transformed Emily Harris's case from an accident file into a full criminal investigation. Detectives presented the evidence to prosecutors. The key exhibit was the audio. On it, Michael Harris not only admitted to murder, but described the very act that explained why a shark had attacked with such focus. His drunken pride became his undoing. For Emily's family, the news was both shocking and vindicating. They had suspected something was wrong from the beginning. Megan Harris, Emily's younger sister, told reporters, "We knew it wasn't just an accident. We just didn't have proof. Now we do." From that point forward, the case was no longer about rumors or suspicions. It was about a husband whose own words had brought him down. The audio tape, Sarah's testimony, Captain Reed's statement, and the expert analysis all converged. What had once been filed away as a freak accident was now officially treated as premeditated murder. Michael Harris had thought he was untouchable. He had thought the ocean had erased the evidence. But his own voice put the crime back on record. And with that, the hunt for justice moved from whispers in living rooms to the courtroom, where he would face the consequences of what he had done. The recording changed everything. What had once been dismissed as a freak accident was now back under the spotlight. The Florida State Attorney's Office moved quickly. A grand jury was convened. They reviewed the audio. Investigators turned to the evidence that had been boxed away for years. In the evidence room of the Monroe County Sheriff's Department sat Emily Harris's wetsuit. It had been sealed after the initial incident. Most believed the case would never reopen. But the seal was still intact, the chain of custody still documented. Lab analysts pulled a section of the fabric from the lower leg area. The results were undeniable. Embedded in the neoprene fibers were traces of protein compounds consistent with fish blood and oils. Not a random smear, not environmental contamination, but a concentrated cluster at the cath. When compared against commercial bait products sold locally in the Florida Keys, the composition matched. A marine biologist testified, "Sharks do not usually strike so fast, so directly. They circle, they test, they wait for weakness." This attack, however, was immediate. The animal went straight for Emily's leg. According to the expert, only a strong scent could explain such an unnatural focus. The lab report gave those words scientific weight. The defense fought back. They tried to undermine the chain of custody. They argued that too many years had passed, that the wetsuit could have been contaminated in storage. But the property records told another story. Every entry and exit of the evidence room had been logged. The seals had not been broken. The judge accepted the lab's findings. Prosecutors layered on the financial motive. They introduced emails that Michael had sent to his insurance provider. In one, he pressed for the accidental death rider to be approved quickly, emphasizing that he needed it in place before his honeymoon. They showed bank statements revealing a purchase at a Key West fishing supply store one day before the dive. On that receipt, bait and lures A call log with the insurance company revealed Michael had asked specific questions about payouts for accidents at sea. It was building into a timeline. First, the insurance rider, then the purchase of bait, then the fatal dive, followed by the quick payout of $1.2 million. The defense filed a motion to suppress the audio recording. They argued it was a drunken joke, made without context, recorded. Sarah Miller also testified. She described nights when Michael came home drunk and repeated the same phrase, that Emily's death had set him up for life. She recalled his pride, not grief. She said she had once believed it was his strange way of coping, but over time, it became clear that it was something darker. Then came Captain Daniel Reed, the snorkeling guide from that fateful day. He described the way Emily had been attacked within minutes of entering the water. He spoke of the panic on the boat, of the blood spreading quickly in the waves. But what stayed with him was Michael's composure before the dive. Other first-time snorkelers had been nervous, jittery. Emily had been excited. Michael had been silent, calm, focused. Too calm, Reed thought, for someone about to take his first dive in open water. The prosecutors called Dr. Alan Cooper, a marine biologist who specialized in shark behavior. He explained how unusual the attack was. The shark had gone straight for Emily. It hadn't tested, it hadn't circled. Sharks don't attack with such concentrated ferocity unless something draws them in, he told the jury. Combined with the lab findings of fish proteins, his conclusion was firm. Something on Emily's wetsuit had attracted the shark. The lab technician walked the jury through the testing process. They explained how the proteins were extracted, how they were matched against samples of commercial bait. They showed charts of peptide sequences, leaving little room for doubt. And they pointed out that control samples from the wetsuits of other snorkelers that day showed no such traces. Only Emily's suit carried the scent. The prosecutors then reconstructed the timeline at the marina. Boat logs showed the exact departure time of the snorkeling trip. Cameras from the dock showed Michael carrying his own dive bag separate from the rented equipment. A store clerk testified that the day before the excursion, Michael had asked for bait with a strong smell to attract big fish. The receipt bore his signature. The prosecution tied it all together: preparation, execution, and payoff. The defense countered hard. They said the jokes were meaningless, the words of a drunk man seeking attention. They said the wetsuit could have picked. The turning point came when the audio was played in open court. The room fell silent as Michael's own voice filled the chamber. I fed her to the sharks. That's how I got rich. She never knew. It was easy money. The words were chilling. No laughter, no sign of a joke. Just a drunk man boasting about what he had done. The jurors leaned forward. Some shook their heads. The prosecutor's final question hammered the point. If it was only a joke, why did the lab find bait proteins on Emily's wetsuit? Why did the receipts show Michael had purchased bait the day before? Why had he rushed to add an accidental death rider just weeks before the trip? Why had he received $1.2 million and bragged about it afterward? The defense had no answer strong enough to shake the weight of that evidence. The judge instructed the jury on reasonable doubt. He told them to consider the evidence as a whole: the confessions, the lab results, the financial documents, the eyewitness accounts. The jury deliberated for hours. They asked to hear the recording again. They asked to review the fishing supply receipt. They studied the insurance documents. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder for financial gain and insurance fraud. The sentence was clear. Michael Harris was ordered to spend the rest of his life in prison with no chance of parole. He was stripped of any remaining insurance benefits. The money he had once celebrated was gone. The legal ripples spread further. Florida Mutual Insurance moved to recover the payout under fraud provisions. The case was cited in law conferences as an example of how retested forensic evidence combined with recorded admissions could overturn an initial ruling. It became a textbook example. A closed case reopened, and a man who thought he had committed the perfect crime finally facing justice. Michael Harris had turned the ocean into a weapon. But it was his own arrogance, his laughter, his confessions, his greed that sealed his fate. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Guilty. The word landed like a hammer. For a moment, no one moved. Then Emily Harris's family broke down. Tears came, but so did relief. They had waited years for this. They had lived through headlines that called her death a tragic accident. Now the truth was finally acknowledged in open court. Megan Harris, Emily's younger sister, stood outside the courthouse surrounded by cameras. Her voice shook, but her words cut through the noise. She loved the ocean. He turned that love into her death sentence. For Megan, it wasn't justice in the sense of restoration. It was justice in the sense of exposure. The world now knew what Michael Harris had done. Jurors later explained why they had no doubt. The recording of Michael's drunken confession, the scientific testing on Emily's wetsuit, the proof that he bought bait and demanded a new insurance rider just before the trip. Those details were the turning points. A case that once looked like a freak accident now stood as a carefully planned killing. Michael Harris was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He lost the right to collect $1 more from Emily's policy. The assets he bought with that money, his house, his luxury car, his new possessions, were frozen and eventually stripped away. A portion was redirected to Emily's family through civil orders. The man who once stood before cameras as a grieving widower left the courtroom in shackles, branded forever as a murderer for profit. Sarah Miller, his second wife, reacted swiftly. Hours after Michael's arrest, she filed for divorce. She changed her last name, packed her belongings, and left Austin. She never returned to the house that had been bought with blood money. In her testimony, she had said it plainly. "I thought I married a widower. Instead, I married a killer." The media called her an accidental witness, the woman whose life intersected with a man hiding the darkest of secrets. Emily's parents decided that their daughter's memory would not be tied only to betrayal. They established the Emily Harris Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting families affected by ocean tragedies. The foundation also funded scholarships for children passionate about marine biology and water safety. Emily's face appeared on posters for a campaign called Safe Waters, reminding travelers that safety could not be ignored. Megan Harris became the public face of that effort, appearing on talk shows and panels. She repeated one phrase again and again: "Don't ignore red flags." The case quickly earned its label in the press. Reporters called it the shark trap case. Headlines were blunt: from honeymoon bliss to insurance murder. Television networks dissected the story in prime-time specials. Podcasts devoted multi-episode series to it. Documentaries reconstructed the dive, For the insurance industry, the case was a wake-up call. Companies began tightening procedures for life insurance approvals. Special scrutiny was applied to large policies purchased just weeks before major trips. Contestability clauses were extended, making it harder for sudden claims to be processed without deep review. At legal conferences, professionals spoke about the Harris case as a textbook example of a murder-for-profit scheme. Linda Thompson, the claims officer who had approved Michael's payout, admitted in a public statement, "If we had known the full picture, we would never have paid so quickly." For prosecutors and forensic experts, the lessons went beyond insurance. The case proved the value of revisiting evidence long thought dormant. The wetsuit had sat in a storage facility for years, yet under new testing methods, it gave up secrets that had been invisible before. Protein traces in the neoprene revealed bait smeared on Emily's leg. "Old evidence can still speak," one lab technician said. And speak it did, loud enough to help convict a killer. Law schools and training programs cited the case when teaching about the chain of custody. Because the wetsuit had been sealed and logged properly, its results carried weight in court. Without that integrity, the defense could have dismissed the findings as contaminated. Instead, the evidence stood strong. The audio confession, the forensic test, and the financial records formed a chain that no defense strategy could break. The public reacted with shock. Many in Florida said the case was a cold reminder that greed can overpower love. In community forums, people compared the Harris case to other infamous insurance murders in American history. True crime experts called it a textbook case of missed warning signs. The sudden life insurance purchase, the unusual calm before the dive, the careless jokes at parties. Each red flag had been visible, but only in hindsight did the pattern become undeniable. Emily Harris was remembered as more than a victim. She was a teacher, a sister, a daughter who loved the water. Her passion for swimming and her dream of opening a children's reading program were cut short. But the case delivered a lasting message. What begins as an accident report may hide a crime. What looks like grief may mask calculation. And what seems buried in evidence storage may one day resurface to tell the truth. The closing image returned to the Florida shoreline. The water was calm, the waves steady. For most, it was a place of escape and beauty. But for those who remembered Emily Harris, the sight of the sea carried a warning. If you believe Emily's story deserves to be remembered, the narrator concluded, subscribe and share. More chilling true crime cases are coming soon.